Sorry, brother. I'll put you okay.
Sure. It's like, I think until you must have saw me and they were like, oh, I didn't know that you were that short. Yes, I am. Good evening, everybody. Looking around the room, I'm going to start on existing protocol. But first of all, to turn around and say thank you to the Tal family. Thank you for sharing Dr. Tal as a student of UTG. I think, just reflecting on what has already been said as well, he was and continues to inspire a generation of scholars in the Gambia, a generation of critical thinkers. But I think, as his daughter also mentioned as well, I think is able to show us, especially in terms of transcending, not just sitting in the classroom and teaching, doing scholarship and research, but also community engagement, making sure that the research that we do, the scholarship that we do is important for nation building, is important for the work that we do, but also the mentorship as well. I mean, say it myself as well as a majority of people, I do move my hands a lot. So it's a testament to, as was already highlighted, is a testament to his character, is a testament to the vision that he has as well. So thank you again for sharing him with us. Thank you. Okay, so I'll start with expressing my thanks to the Center for Research and Development, CRPD. My dear friend and colleague and collaborator actually, said, as he mentioned, from Voice of the Young to Methodist Academy to UTG, and to now we've really traveled far as well, and also to the CRPD team as well, to Zahra, as well as all the others, including Alice and Babukar, for the support that has been given throughout as well. I do like to recognize the Honorable Minister, part of UTG, not to say those that are not UTG alum, I think this is a big thing for us right now, so please bear with us as well. Thank you always for your guidance and support and for always trying to bring me back to UTG. Obviously UTG is always in my head. I remember when I graduated back in 2011, and went to South Africa for my master's. I came back, and then I was appointed as the youngest lecturer at the Faculty of Law. And I remember that I was given the senior class, the one that comes in the afternoon, where we have the National Assembly members and the IGP and others in that class. And it was like, who's this little girl just standing in front of us, right? But it also just showed how, especially as it relates to the commitment and the resources that have been invested in emerging scholars, this gathering is a showcase of that, but also the incredible work that my colleagues also do as well. Again, thank you to, he doesn't like the title, but thank you to Commissioner Drame for being here as well, and for his continued support and guidance. I haven't seen, I see left at the back, I know he's hiding, Lamin Camera, as well as others that I see around the room as well. I do also want to say thank you both to Madi Jobati as well as Ndengone Jeng, who agreed to be discoursant when they did not see the paper. So do bear with them when they are taking notes to also reflect as well. And to, I look around the room, I see family, I see friends, I see collaborators, but I also see, concerned Gambians as well as allies, recognizing the diplomatic corps with the charge d'affaires of the EU being here and being supportive of the vision and the work that we continue to do as well. So regarding the talk itself, I do talk a little bit fast, so I'm going to try and pace myself. And hope that you do not go to sleep. I was thinking that if I began this talk talking about the theories of republicanism, democracy, state building, decolonization, and all the concepts that we've been talking about, or are about to talk about, I think you will not want to see that, because then I think you will sleep. So what I intend on doing today, especially as it relates to the topic of the Gambia at the crossroads, forging a Republican future, is to perhaps add my two bututs. I know two bututs, nobody sees two bututs anymore. I don't even know whether that exists, right? But let's just go with it. To some of the critical questions that was raised by the moderator as it relates to how we rethink about the organization of the Gambian state, especially in line with the ideals of democracy and good governance principles. And I should recognize, obviously, Uncle Ron for being the person before UTG for actually giving me my first job, both in relation to Paradise with King Kiliba, but also just letting me have a 2 hours primetime show that I brought a group of us just talking throughout. Every week we just talk about youth issues in the Gambia, which has continued to today, and that is really a testament to his character, but also his commitment to empowering young people as well. So thank you, Uncle Ron. I know you're waiting for the the $200 fee or something, but I'll give it to you later. Yeah, the tax, exactly the tax. So fellow Gambians, friends, and distinguished guests. I think we will all agree that we stand today at a crossroads and building, and when we think about building democracy, when we think about building time-tested democracy, we obviously know that especially within the Gambian context, this has been long, this has been a challenging process with obviously periods of progress, but also setbacks as well. And with our recent, perhaps checkered history and style, we'll anyway. But today, as I said, I really wanted to just zero in, especially given the context that we're from. As you all know, obviously, in 2016, we started this very ambitious process, the beginning of the end, perhaps, of an authoritarian regime where we've witnessed elections being manipulated, but also to maintain, as obviously we knew from the past 22 years, that elections were manipulated to maintain an uneven playing field that did not result, obviously. There was an exemption in 2016, but with the earlier elections, it was really to legitimize his rule. It was really to keep him in power as well. And so the elections were not really about democratization, but they were really about preserving the status quo in that sense. But however, we know what happened in 2016. We all sort of have lived that in various ways and in various forms, some in Senegal, some in the diaspora, some people in this room hiding somewhere in rural Gambia as well. But I think what is interesting, especially given majority of folks in academia in the room as well, is that what transpired in the Gambia, which was, I think, one of the fewest occurrences in which a military turned civilian president who had total control as relates to the elections as well as the mechanisms and the institutions at that particular time, lost an election, which is very interesting, especially even though my background is not political science, I do dabble, as Professor Sen will know, I do dabble in everything as well, because I do think, as we think about, even with rethinking about what this means for Gambia moving forward, it's also been interdisciplinary. We cannot really stay in our own siloed disciplines, in our own siloed ways, that it is necessary that we have scholars, but we also have practitioners on the ground. We have the media and everybody working towards making this a difference as well. I recently published a book chapter titled Democratic Consolidation in the Gambia, a cup half full, half empty, or more. That's an open-ended question, which I hope you'll be able to answer as well. But really thinking about and contributing to and critiquing the sort of existing scholarship that we have as it relates to democratic consolidation, which in majority of the cases, there is the argument that there is a limitation as it relates to the potential for democratic consensus to emerge in such repressive environments as we were within the Gambian context as well. But I did argue that I think the Gambia is always interesting, given that it's an understudy area, it's always interesting in terms of being able to contribute unique insights into the existing scholarship, but also critiquing the limitations of dominant models of existing scholarship and theories, especially around nationhood, around state building, but also around democratic consolidation as well. And so I wanted to start with saying, I think, as it relates to this lecture, I hope you stay with me. It will be a potpourri of things as well, because I think I did talk to quite a lot of people to say, and Dr. Kabir is here as well, to say, what did you want to hear, right? It was like, I could do the boring thing and just focus on important, but the legal framework, our judicial system, and things like that. But also thinking broader, especially in terms of the topic itself and how, as I said, the necessity for that to be interdisciplinary, the necessity for that to be holistic as well. So just quickly, in terms of what I'll try to do in the next 20-25 minutes, to bear with me, I know it's a little bit warm here, is to briefly look at the historical context, the legacy of the 1997 Constitution. I then wanted to zero in at least on 10 contextual issues that I think are one of the biggest challenges in the Gambian context. A disclaimer, obviously, there will not be an exhaustive list. It is from my perspective, my own research, my own engagement that I think we need to address, and also thinking about the path forward as well. In terms of the historical perspective and the context, I'm just going to give the cliff note. I am, a disclaimer, I am no historian. I am a student who is interested, especially as it relates to legal history within the Gambian context, but also how our historical past really can inform us as we think about the current context of the Gambia and where we want to go as well. So, if we wanted, we could go all the way back to pre-colonial times. I'm sure there are historians here, so I wouldn't attempt to do that. But, from the Jollof Empire to the Mandinka Empire to the Jolas resisting and all of that, is also to say that, when we were in pre-colonial history, before the British came in as well, is really thinking about some of the elements out of our pre-colonial history in terms of how that speaks to our desire for self-rule that remains important, I think, particularly today, as we know, with Gambia at a crossroad in that instance. So thinking about from the arrival of the British in the 19th century to the model of colonization that we see within the Gambian context, which was indirect rule, as well as all the other elements, especially as it relates to direct rule in Batos, now Banjul, but also indirect rule as well within the protectorate as well. But I think what I wanted to highlight, and I think this is particularly important, and which I'm sure we all know, is that there is really a central focus on decolonization right now, especially in terms of what that looks like for former colonized people within Africa, but also globally as well, especially in terms of thinking about that, the colonial folks that came in, whether it was the British, whether it was the Portuguese or the French, really came in, from the Berlin Conference to divide up Africa, really focused on how they could extract, obviously, raw materials, and not necessarily to center the interests of the people that they found as well. And I'm taking a little bit of time to say this because I think what is interesting, I think, especially as we think about the main features of political dispensation in the Gambia under colonial rule, as I said, with the indirect rule, and as well as the direct rule in instance, and how that has manifested with the chiefs and the traditional leaders that we also have even today with regard to our own Gambian legal history. As I said, I'm a little bit passionate about legal history, and I was telling someone that the other day that perhaps that should potentially be my next research agenda if I have funding to actually engage into the British Archive, but also look at other things as well. And I'm gonna pivot a little bit and say, just to re-echo, I think Said's point as well to the importance of CRPD, but also to the importance of why academia is important, why research is important as we think about policy making, as we think about evidence-based advocacy and research. Is also for for government as well to recognize that academia is not its enemy, that we're here to support, thank you, to support, to provide where necessary the support that is needed to inform decision making, to inform policy making, to build infrastructures, to then engage as well. But anyway, so just going back to independence, 1965 rather, and I just wanted to point out, with the work that was done, especially by, it's all. This is not just the Gambian context, but especially when we are talking about the struggle for independence, usually we tend to focus on the forefathers, I'm sure. We also have the foremothers as well, and this is not obviously unique within the Gambian context. In December, I was in Addis in the African Union building, and you turn around and it's all, all Pan-Africanist men, but all of them are men, and I was like, where are the women? Because women obviously were engaged in the independence struggle as well. So thinking about that, especially, if we have history students here, I think it would be a great time as well to sort of also look into those things as well. But as obviously, as we all know, we sort of gained independence in 1965. And then in 1970, then the republicanism, and we became a republic with the 1970 Constitution. I am going to say and pin this: we're not opening the Pandora's box, because I know there are people in the room, Madi Spotlight, about a debate in terms of when Gambia was truly independent. So, but I'm not going to open the Pandora's box as well. But obviously knowing that within the Gambian context, but also I think within the broader African context as well, is recognizing that when we gain independence, and to today, we could continue to have a conversation about the continued legacy of colonialism, neocolonialism, and what that looks like, especially as we think about decolonization and things like that. I also wanted to, I think at that particular point as well, and given the fact that my background also is in human rights, I just wanted to spotlight the former president, President Jawara, especially in terms of the incredible work that he did. I'm not trying to paint a rosy, uncheckered account of history. Obviously, we know that there were challenges then, which, as I said, I'm no historian, so I'm not going to go into that. But I think for me, what was particularly interesting, given my own interest in human rights, was in terms of the Gambia's contribution, especially as we think about both the drafting, but also the adoption of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which we know is the first international human rights instrument that provides for the variety of rights, political and civil rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights, which eventually also led to us hosting the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is currently having its 79th session as well. But I do have a semi-long quote from Jawara because I thought it was very interesting. So in 1978, in his statement to the UN General Assembly, and I'll quote it directly as well. So quote, the Gambia was under foreign rule for many centuries. Throughout the dark period of our history, colonialism deprived our people of the most basic of human rights, such as the right to choose their leaders and own their system of government, and the right to develop their indigenous culture. Then came the gallant struggle for independence, and finally independence itself. With the attainment of self-determination and independence, it will indeed be ironic if the freedom gained from the defeat of colonialism should again be denied to our people by our own leaders. After centuries of a deliberate policy of dehumanization, subjugation, and oppression, the minimum our people expect and must have is the full enjoyment of their political, economic, social, and cultural rights. It should be the duty of all of us to strive to ensure that everywhere in the world today, people enjoy those rights. For us in the Gambia, human rights are indivisible and universal and include also social and economic rights. End quote. I thought this was important, especially given that this was said in 1978 and his contribution as well to, as I said, both the African Charter, but also the Commission, and ultimately what we now consider as the African human rights system as well. However, I think, when we come back to history, especially during that time, obviously progress is not linear. I'm sure some of you, the older folks in the room, were here around during the 1981 coup. some of us, the younger ones, were not here, but obviously we've read the scholarship done and the research done by the seasoned scholars and academics in the room as well. But that obviously then did stall our progress a bit. That ultimately then led to the Senegambia Confederation, which at some point we also ended as well, even though it was, I think, just from reading as well, that it was a bold experiment of its time, despite the fact that it did not, it did not continue, given the fact that, and I read the Karabakh book, where he made a case that perhaps one of the main reasons was concerns about the Gambia's sovereignty, as well as other things as well. But I think it is also interesting, especially given the times that we're in terms of understanding what the main reasons were, especially given that we're I think for Senegambia relationships, we're at a point where there is sort of a reset, right? A reset, an opportunity for us to reset, to think about how we better collaborate, both in relation to establish areas of trade, tourism, as well as security, but also increasing as well, especially with the climate crisis that is ultimately also going to affect Gambia, but particularly in the Casamance region with deforestation as well. But as we all know, then in 1994, we had the coup d'etat and Jammeh came into power. And I wanted to pivot then to the 1997 Constitution, which I have spent so much of my time now on as well. But thinking about the legacy of the 1997 Constitution, especially given the current context that we find ourselves as well. As you all know, this was drafted and then adopted, came into being in 1997, which sort of obviously still serves to today a framework for governance for all of us as well. I think when you look at the 1997 Constitution, despite the fact that, obviously we have Chapter 4, which provides for fundamental human rights, and I think the majority of us have engaged in this process, especially during the drafting of the new Constitution, its limitations, but I think when we think about governance and the political system, is really thinking about how the 1997 Constitution established but continues to establish a system where power resides in the presidency and power resides in the executive, and what that means, especially as we think about going forward from where we are, especially as it relates to more inclusive leadership, more ethical leadership, especially around those issues as well. Because I think part of the challenge that we all know is that the 1997 Constitution, despite obviously its good elements, has led to unchecked power, and given the need that we do need a new constitutional framework that speaks to the needs and that speaks to the needs of our times currently as well. I think when we also think about the legacy of the 1997 Constitution, as a women rights scholar, as an African feminist, I also think that, especially as we think about how the Gambia, very similar to other African countries, including most especially West African countries, with a plural legal system, continues to disadvantage the majority of our population, which is women. So as we all know, obviously the 1997 Constitution, including, in addition to the judicial precedents, legislation, as well as others, also provides for personal law. And recently I engaged in the launch of a report by Equality Now, which looked at over 20 countries, I think, if I'm not mistaken about the number, looking at personal laws, especially as it relates to those countries and how it continues to impact the rights of women and girls as well. Recently, in an op-ed that I did titled "Decolonizing the Narrative Around Constitutions, Personal Laws, and Women's Rights," it's also, as I said, really acknowledging that discriminatory personal law regimes have profound and far-reaching effect on women's lives that we should perhaps also think about as well. In terms of the 22 years of Jammeh, as we know, elections happen. I think that also brings into question as well an open-ended question in terms of, what does democracy look like for the Gambian context? obviously there has been more contested debates whether countries need to continue having elections every 4 or 5 years. Obviously, we know that I think, especially when we look at what are the ideals of constitutionalism, thinking about separation of power, thinking about the opportunity to alternate power, and that's why election obviously matters as well. But I also think part of what we should be thinking about as well is what that means, especially not just within the Gambia, but also regionally as well. I wouldn't rehearse, the Jammeh's times. Obviously, I think the work that has recently been completed by the TRRC, but also the ongoing work as well with the transitional justice process, with the potential hybrid court, as well as the other processes that we have. We obviously know that Jammeh's regime touch on so many issues, whether those are amending the constitution more than 50-something times, to repressing freedom of speech, freedom of the media, to curtailing both the civic space, but also the space as well for political participation. I think we could spend the whole day talking about that, so I'll pivot as well. I think for me, what I wanted to do as well for the majority of the time, as I said, consulted folks from the uncles to my husband to other people as well to say, what do you want to hear, right? And part of the answer that I got was really in terms of, from your own perspective, but also from what you've seen, as well as engaging with others, both the research, but also the engagement as well as Jindu and others also highlighted, that I do like to call myself a scholar practitioner or a scholar activist. That means that I am not only in the classroom, I'm also, as much as possible, supporting the incredible work that so many people and so many activists in the room now are doing as well, in relation to be able to provide evidence, but also other sort of support as well. Was to zero in and say, I have 10, so bear with me, I have 10 contextual issues that varied from agriculture to a constitutional framework, to issues of gender, to issues of education as well. And I think, we were just having a side discussion before, but as I indicated, I think what we could do is, perhaps then pivot into having the quarterly sort of public lecture engagement seminar style thing where some of these issues, I hope, then can be, so I'm giving the cliff note. Obviously, I do not want you to slip in, so I'll give the cliff note as it relates to these 10 contextual issues. One, obviously, given my love for constitutionalism and the work that I continue to do as well, is really thinking about how the Gambia currently has a democratically deficient constitutional framework, right? And part of this is really acknowledging that due to the fact that we still do have the 1997 Constitution, we are maintaining the status quo from the Jammeh regime, despite obviously the incredible work and the work that has been done by the current government, but obviously slow progress, especially given the need for a new constitution, given the need to revamp our legal system, particularly when we look at our penal code, but also other orders as well, including the Public Order Act, as well as other laws as well. But I think particularly when we think about this, and especially as we think about governance as well, is really, as I indicated before, I think what the 1997 Constitution does, but also just our constitutional as well as our legal framework, is the concentration of power, right? Which obviously then results in the personalization of power. As we know, obviously Jammeh, like most political leaders in Africa, also did use ethnicity as well, and this is not just a Gambian thing, but also there is enough literature, particularly showcasing the ethnic consensus is evident during elections to show alliances as well. But I think what is, and this is my own personal opinion, especially as we think about how to address the deficiency in our constitutional and legal framework, is also to recognize that our political parties by default are tribalized. And this is the reason for this is because in most cases, the members of the political parties sort of are from the ethnic groups. And this is not to say it's a generalizable, I have not done research. I mean, I could, I know the political leaders and the ethnic groups that they're in, but also we've seen who the members of the parties are. I think both for, when thinking about this, for example, with the APRC. Despite the fact that there is a broad sort of quote-unquote support during the Jammeh regime, we know that the Jolas comprise majority of it. When you think about the UDP, it is the Mandinkas. When you think about MPP, it might be the Fullers. I mean, there is a mixture, obviously, but I also think that partly the personalization of powers I was talking about, especially as it relates to our constitution and how we see political leaders, also means that sometimes we align to not necessarily because of ideals, but because of the personnel, right? And so we also, in our own very small ways, also contribute to the big man syndrome as well. And so what that does then is that it concentrates power not just on the presidency, not just on the ruling party, but also on the opposition as well, especially as we think about how parties, including both the ruling party, but also oppositional parties within the Gambian context, but also generally as well, often struggle to survive leadership changes or function democratically within themselves, right? Because then the concentration might be on one individual as well. So I think for me, partly as well, thinking about our deficient democratic constitutional framework is really thinking about how do we go beyond personalities as we think about the distinct platforms that political parties and the important role that political parties can offer the Gambian people as well. I think the other problematic issue I also, and which I'm sure people have engaged here as well, is just this idea of the winner takes all, right? As we know, obviously, the 1997 Constitution has the majority, force past the post, which mainly makes us a single constituency in that sense. But what this does then is, if the person that wins, then in most cases, it creates the perception that their political party or the winning political party views the state as their own personal property, right? And so then what that means is that then that political party, the one that wins the election, then gives rewards. And this is not unique in terms of the Gambian context, right? You could think about Senegal, you can think about other African countries where then the winning party obviously then gives either positions or other rewards to their loyalists in those instances as well. The high centralized power, I think, also is not just problematic at the top, but I also think as we think about the utility of decentralization and how our centralized ways of doing things really also disadvantages our local government organs and mechanisms and institutions as well, because in certain cases, the central government then looks at the local government as enemies or as people that are working against them in competition with, rather than as allies, and which are supposed to really very closer to the ground, to the grassroots, be able to engage and provide the necessary support that is needed as well. I cannot complete on the deficient constitutional framework without obviously mentioning that the Gambian context really, especially as we think about our constitutional and legal framework, is non-exclusive, right? Non-exclusive governments in the sense that the current constitution obviously, recognizes women's rights and equality and things like that. But obviously, we know that beyond just legal barriers, that cultural, societal, economic barriers prevents women who form majority of the Gambian population from actually ascending to leadership as well. And we saw this evident very much, especially during the failed attempt at introducing the legislative quota not too long ago. But also as someone who is still a youth, I know it's weird because then I was in Abuja a couple of weeks ago and I said, wait, why are you not including me? I'm a youth. And somebody was like, no, you're too, you shouldn't be considered a youth, right? But age-wise, I am a youth, and I think we cannot talk about the constitution, we cannot talk about inclusive governance without really adhering and paying attention to the fact that young people as well who form the majority of the Gambian population are missing, especially as we think about decision-making processes and so forth as well. Are you still with me? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so the second issue, number 2. We'll go fast. I know number 1 was a little bit too long, but it's my passion baby as well. Number 2, I think we also think about weak institutions, right? And I mean, I'm sure all of you will agree that it continues to serve as one of the major critical roadblocks to the Gambia's national development as well. And I think for me, as we think about weak institutions and what that means, is really thinking about how we reform governance structures as well. So thinking about my own take is, and I know this might be a radical take, and it will take more than just saying it, is really a need to perhaps overhaul our governance system, right? And I will zero in on two. I think one is really thinking about the judiciary. As obviously as we know, during the Jammeh regime, the judiciary was co-opted, but also there were active attempts at eroding judicial independence through whether it was through the threats, it was through the lack of security, but also as I recently indicated in a book chapter that I did as part of the the Cambridge Handbook of Foreign Judges on domestic bench. I talked about foreign judges on the Gambian bench and the implications for that. And I think as we think about the judiciary, I think we can also acknowledge obviously positive threats as well, right? One is the Gambianization of the judiciary, which has, I think, has been one of the most progressive thing that we've seen since the transition as well. In relation to that, but I think also as we think about, as I said, especially with regard to the special accountability mechanisms and the next steps and phases for the transitional justice process, for the Gambia to stay on track, the judiciary is important as we think about support that's needed, as we think about what it means for them to be an active player, an active actor in ensuring constitutional ideas, in ensuring that our democracy is protected as well in relation to that. I think the second one, which I'm sure you'll all agree, has to do with our public delivery service system. I think, and there has been incredible work also being done and continues to be done, especially by civil society organization, holding government accountable for our public services to be efficient, responsive, and corrupt-free. We recently has laws that addresses the issue of corruption as well, but I think we can also acknowledge that the lack of efficiency, the lack of resources and the training and the necessities to ensure that our public service is and addresses the needs of our people has been very limited. I mean, when you look at the healthcare system, obviously we have and continue to have under-equipped hospitals, poorly trained staff, and continue to meet the very basic health needs of majority of the Gambian population, especially those that cannot afford paying out of pocket as well. And I think as we think about addressing corruption, also thinking about our lack of digital infrastructure, but also in certain cases, perhaps it might be a generational thing as well, but in certain cases, the resistance to technological advancement and what that means, given that, we have the rise of AI and everybody's concerned that their jobs are going to be taken over by AI, as well as others, but also even within the Gambian context, thinking about, the resistance might be that folks might think that they will not be needed anymore, especially if we think about digitalization and the need for that as well. And then the third issue I think that we also need to talk a little bit about is compromised leadership. I've already alluded to this before, but I think the Gambia is a point where what we need is not just strong leadership, not a capable leadership, but we do need ethical leadership. Because really leadership is the cornerstone of any successful nation. But I also think part of our challenge is not that our leaders do not have perhaps well-intentioned ideas, but I also think that partly as well we do have leaders that come to leadership roles in very different ways, sometimes accidental ways, right? And so I think that also provides for us as well, especially as we think about how do we strengthen our leadership, is also thinking about what our leadership capacity needs, especially even for those that are currently in leadership roles or coming up as well, especially thinking about what that looks like. So, I mean, it could be as simple as, I don't know, having a training for having leadership training for somebody that's newly appointed as a head of institution or as a minister, take a couple of, do a 1-year leadership course or something, but that really engages in terms of being very intentional about what it means to be a leader, about what it means to be an ethical and an inclusive leader within that context as well. And I already mentioned the inclusive leadership, but that obviously then touches on the issue of the inclusion of both women and young people as well. And pivoting to economic development, economic rights, and particularly, I think, gender inequality. And I wanted to connect that, as I said, one of my areas is women's rights, and so I do tend to always try to come back to that, because I think what I'm trying to convey here, and if nothing with the 10 contextual issues, is also to see that these things are not siloed, that they are interconnected and interrelated, and that one area, if we have weakness in one area, obviously it's going to impact what we produce and the outcomes for our people as it relates to the different areas as well. So thinking about our country's economic development and how especially given sort of the disadvantaged position the women continue to be placed as well. I think part of the challenge obviously is on the investment in our human capital, and our human capital here is obviously women and young people. And so thinking about, especially in terms of the challenges the women face, whether that's credit, whether that's access to land, but also, access to financial support as well. And this is not to say that initiatives and processes are not happening, but they're not happening fast, they're not happening sustainably, and they're not happening efficiently. And so I do think there is need to rethink of, even as we think about the existing initiatives that we have, the existing policies that we have as well. I'm talking about policies. Yesterday I was talking to my husband, who said, Gambia has a lot of policies. I do agree. We do love our laws and policies. I think it's important. As somebody with a legal background, I believe that legal frameworks are important, whether those are laws or policies. But I think one of the key challenges, obviously, in relation to the Gambian context, has always been implementation. Our laws and our policies are usually paper tigers, and how we sort of ensure the implementation of those, I think, continue to be vital as well. And thinking about gender inequality, already mentioned it, but I do think that as we think about both the economic empowerment of women, youth skills development as well, I think that it is also important that we do support, and I'm reiterating it again, we do support women's ascension to leadership role. I do think and believe that women are capable, Gambian women are capable, given that we're natural born multitaskers and are ones that are very inclusive, that I would like to see sometime soon a female president in the Gambia as well. We are able to do it. I mean, I think there is need for that sort of investment as well. And as we think about even young people ascending to that as well, there are already folks in the room as well that have engaged and have expressed interest, especially in terms of taking up those roles as well. And what they need and what we need is well-intentioned, not just well-intentioned policies and laws, but actually also putting in the money where the amounts are as well. And then, as academics, and I know the Honorable Minister is still here, higher education, but still, I wanted to also pivot to talk a little bit about our educational system, right? My experience when I was in Methodist, I think I took the grade 9 exams. I got a fairly good aggregate, which meant that the teachers in the school, at least when I was being enrolled, thought that I should go into the science class, right? And my interest is never, as you obviously highlighted, I started my activism when I was 8 with the Banjo Red Cross Society, where then they had to come and pick me up from London Corner and walk with me to the park, but also to be able to attend those things as well. I've always been invested and always been interested in governance issues, and which obviously meant within the Gambian context, especially in high school, it's arts, right? And so there was, this idea that I needed to be in science because I had a good aggregate, but I wasn't necessarily interested in science as well. This is a very small window, which continues to happen today. I hope not so much, but I think given the current context that we find ourselves, I think there needs to be really a rethinking of our educational system, and I think we should start from the point of acknowledging that teachers and lecturers and professors do not know it all, And it is really important, and I wanted to spotlight Paulo Freire, an influential Brazilian educator, especially his criticism of current teaching methods in his work, The Banking Concept of Education, where he, for example, argued that our traditional schooling as a one-way street really means that teachers passively transmit knowledge, like you deposit money in the bank, right? Neglecting to encourage students' active participation in critical thinking. Sometimes we're having a conversation and we're like, why was I drawing a cockroach in junior school? I mean, I don't know, right? But thinking about what our educational systems are. I think when we think about curriculum, and perhaps they are more updated books, right? But thinking about and going back to this idea that if students are reading books that are Western books that are talking about snow, that are talking about things that we don't have in our own context, it becomes difficult to be able to translate that very theoretical knowledge into practical and tangible understanding that this is not something that works with. I mean, instead of snow, we can talk about the rainy season, right? As well. So I think that our educational system as it is, it's not fit for purpose, and that's the reality as well. The World Economic Forum recently did a research where they sort of emphasized that given the current need of the 21st century, that skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, and digital literacy in the modern workforce is what is needed, right? So thinking about going beyond one traditional one-sided teaching to one that is really holistic, one that really provides students the opportunity to engage in the US. We sometimes call it experiential learning as well, where our classes are project-based, and this doesn't necessarily have to be just at the university level, but you can have students that are in the basic and secondary education system to be able to engage in problem solving, critical thinking, and things from reading a book and actually, doing an essay based on that to examine comprehension, for example. I mean, I don't have the numbers at hand, obviously, but I think we all know the sort of disappointing results we've been having and coming out, especially from the exams as well. But I also think, and as we think about this lecture, especially in terms of the work that and the legacy of Dr. Sajatal, I think, especially as we think about mentorship, I think it continues to be one of the major barriers and one of the challenges, especially in our education system. So it's not just about the curriculum, right? It is also, I think, both in relation to, especially at the university level, in relation to mentorship. But also, as we think about even the pupils as well, is really thinking about counseling as well in terms of, if I pivoted and went into science, I'm sure I might maybe be a medical doctor or a programmer or something like that, right? But it wasn't really my career interest. It wasn't really my career goal as well. So thinking about, being able to have counselors in schools who are able to support our young people to think of more strategically, especially as it relates to, finding out that somebody is really strong at writing and encouraging them to be able to write. If somebody is interested in computers, being able to encourage them to think about tech as well as others as well. I am saying all of this also to acknowledge, obviously, that our teachers are one of the folks that are least paid in our society. So we are also, as I talk about these ideas, we are also asking more of them, and which should not be the case. So in terms of also not just being able to place not just being able to place the counselors, the mentors in these spaces, but also asking more of teachers is to ensure that they are better paid. The universities and the schools are better paid as well. I'm so glad that now we also do have the Faraba has finally, even though the law faculty, I should say, I need to spotlight it, we had the most beautiful campus in UTG. We had the newer one as well. Even though we did start in the printing, so we were, small in the printing, sharing sharing the space as well with printing. But I think the investment and the vision that has gone into both higher education, but also I think calls on us as well to refocus, especially as we think about basic and secondary education as well. I am going to spotlight the sixth thing, which I am not an expert on, is agriculture. So bear with me as well. I think our problem, obviously, which everybody knows, is that we are a non-food sufficient nation. Given that agriculture, in terms of employment, from the data that I got, comprised at least 49% of the employment. But obviously, we know that a nation that cannot feed itself is open to external forces and is the mercy of external forces, as we especially think about inflation globally. That it's not just a Gambian problem, but it's also globally as well, and what that means, especially given the fact that majority of the food that we eat is actually imported elsewhere as well. Part of the problem, I think, has to do with the outmoded farming practices and the low appeal as well, because farming obviously is seen as low-paying, physically demanding profession with limited opportunities for advancement. And I think that's part of the challenge, right? If we have more than majority of the Gambian population being young people, some with university education, some with higher education or basic education, and you are trying to convince them to be farmers, it requires that we also invest in farmers. Because if you see farmers, and do excuse my language here, sometimes, you know, we feel bad for them, right? Oh, ki amul halis, oh, ki nyaka na harama dimbaleko. Because in most cases, that's the reality, right? There is no way that we can convince young people to then say, oh, we want to be farmers. Because I don't want to end up being, you know, somebody that people will help out, right? Somebody that people will give a 200 here or 500 there, because obviously our seasonal farming did not yield what was needed as well. I think part of it as well, as I already indicated, is obviously the reliance on imported goods. More than 50% of the consumption obviously comes from outside, and so that also means that you know, price fluctuations as well as other external factors means that the farmers that are actually doing the work as well are dependent, are not able to get the sort of support that they need, right? It is interesting to me as a, you know, non-expert in this field, why we in the Gambia, with the River Gambia, are still doing 3 months seasonal farming, just focused on the rainy season. We do have the River Gambia. I'm sure this has already been parroted quite a number of times, especially I'm sure by experts. But why are we not really engaging in irrigation, right? Irrigation that ensures that we are able to engage in you know, in year-long farming, year-round farming as well. And I think part of, if the question, for example, is with regard to, oh, we do not want to do it for free, right? We could also build an irrigation system that requires farmers to also pay low-cost access, right? Because then that also means that we're able to contribute to that. But it's not just about the irrigation system, because I think part of our problem also is not just the lack of infrastructure. Sometimes when we have the infrastructure, we do not have the trained personnel to ensure that we're able to maintain that sustainably. And so we come back to zero, right? I mean, the ferry issue is a good example as well. And then I also think that part of you know, subsidizing the farmers, especially to help lower production costs, should also be, I think, part of what we should be thinking about is how we scale up mechanized agriculture, right? So thinking about that we're in the 21st century, what that looks like, especially as we think about investment in training programs as well. I also think that part of the challenge is, and as I said, I'm not an expert in this space, but also this speaks to the general context as well, in relation to, you know, policies. Sometimes government policies, or especially those that are sectoral policies, might be there, but majority of the folks that are supposed to accrue the benefits of these policies do not know about it. So I do think transparency is key here, but also ensuring that, you know, we are not just told that the policies are here, but if you're talking about a farmer who cannot speak English, how do they know what the policies are, right? And how to actually engage and actually get the benefits that these policies are supposed to be meant for as well. Now, on the 7th point, I'm going to turn to security and defense, which is obviously Said's first love, or maybe second after the wife and the kids as well. You know, I do think, especially given the Gambian context, where we've seen and have experienced, you know, multiple, sometimes successful coups, right? Less of that, but in most cases, unsuccessful coups have been led, especially by the military, which in one way or the other sorts of also feeds into it serving as a threat to our peace and security, but also in terms of the democratic consolidation as well. I know Said is obviously very much involved in the security sector reform. My own take is that I do think that we also need to engage in thinking about cost-effective and security strategy as well. I know this is a controversial issue. I know there is no agreement as to whether we need to eradicate the military or not. That's an open-ended debate, which we wouldn't open the Pandora's box here as well. But I also think part of thinking and engaging with the security sector reform as well, and I'm sure Said might come later to make a comment, I think is really thinking about how we can scale down the military in a way that makes them well-equipped, makes them also that streamlines the military that meets our needs as well, both in relation to also engaging with, and I put it in code as well, in terms of engaging with the police force and building strong regional partnerships as well. Talking about the police, I think we do need a well-trained and equipped force, which I think is vital for our internal security. I think you all are aware of the state of insecurity in the Gambia currently as well. I do think that allocating, right, or reallocating resources alone wouldn't really solve the deep-seated corruption issues that we've seen in the police. They do need to be paid well. They need to be trained as well. So I do think there is need to think about a multi-pronged approach that talks about stricter oversight, better recruitment, as well as competitive salaries as well. And then the 8th issue, we're almost there. The 8th issue is really thinking about regional ties. As I said, I've alluded to this before, especially as we think about you know, our neighbors and our historical ties and cultures with our neighbors, whether that's Senegal, but also our other West African countries, but also, you know, beyond that in the region as well. And really thinking about how do we foster a shared identity that sort of transcends, and I know this is a cliche, but that sort of transcends the artificial boundaries that we inherited from colonialism. And so thinking about, especially as it relates to regional cooperation and collaboration that really focuses on inter-regional trade, and that really then brings us to how, for example, really the ideals and the vision of the CFTA, where goods and services flow freely within the African region as well. But talking about Senegambian integration as well, as I mentioned, I think what we've seen, especially in the post-Jammeh era, is that there is a re-engagement, a positive re-engagement with our Senegalese brothers and sisters, especially which I think if you compare it to the Jammeh years, along with former President Ablaye Wade, was a different story. But also I think, as I mentioned, I think, and we do have scholars who also engage in these as well, is that given the recent developments that we have in Senegal, especially with the post-Sahel era as well, I think it really opens up the space that we can engage beyond just the traditional areas of collaboration that we've engaged before as well, but also thinking about integration and building relations with other West African markets, but also beyond that as well. The 9th issue I also wanted to spotlight was public health and financial insecurity. I know I'm putting together 2, but I really wanted to stick to 10. So that was the reason why I did as well. I think I already alluded to the emergency healthcare and really the healthcare system not really addressing the needs, especially of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable of our people. as well. But I also think, and given that I did talk about young people and the youth as well, I also think we're not focusing and talking and paying attention to our drug crisis, right? I think it's a, I don't think I think, I believe it is a serious issue that we're not really focusing on. I'm sure there are pockets, obviously, of people, but I think we need more of a holistic and a strategic approach, especially given the sort of increase in relation to accessibility of, both the unregulated cocktail that we know as the Kosh, but also the hard drugs as well. I mean, Said also, especially with some of his collaborators, have also indicated, as well as other regional organizations, how the Gambia is a transit point, especially when we think about hard drugs, right? So thinking about cocaine, heroin, especially for as transit point for South American cocaine as well, and the need to ensure that we protect our sea, our land, our air borders, but I think most importantly, how we address holistically the issue, especially as it relates to the young people who are the future of this country, and the repercussions, the negative repercussions of that, especially as it relates to mental health needs, but also beyond that, that this is not just an individual problem, it should be really a national agenda going forward as well. I think in the same time as well, and as I indicated, civil society as well as actors are already engaged in this, but it is also the issue also is our national debt crisis, right? We know that, especially if you wanted information, you could get certain information as it relates to our loans from the IMF, from the World Bank, but also from other development banks as well, which accounts for at least 30% of our total external debt. However, I think when we think about other loans, whether those are from external creditors as well, we do not have enough information, and I think that has always been an issue in relation to transparency, and it takes us back to the issue of public service delivery and the need for transparency, but also especially as we think about, as we think about what this means in terms of the issue of debt, especially given the fact that currently available data sort of shows that a debt to GDP ratio of 72%, indicating that the Gambia's debt level is presently about $1.7 billion US dollars. This might not be an adequate estimate, but I'm sure relevant authorities have more updated than the IMF, for example. But also that there has been focused as well that given the sort of debt service that we're doing, that between 2024 and 2029, it will increase to 18.18%, which means that we will at least have an estimate of 1.9 billion US dollars by 2029. And recently, obviously, I think most of us listened to the 2024 budget report, where it was indicated that the national debt service payments have increased from $4 billion in 2023 to $7.5 billion in 2024, which represented a 74% increment, but also comprises more than 25% of our total budget, which in total is equivalent to the budget allocation to education, health, and the agricultural sectors that I already mentioned as well. So I do think, and I've not done research, also another disclaimer, I'm no economist as well, but given the numbers that the Gambia's national debt that we've seen that has been accumulated for from the past 8 years rather, from 2016 might be higher than the debt that we accrued from independence to 2016, right? So I do think this is important we pay attention to. As I said, I'm no expert in this space, but I do think as we think about nation building, as we think about what this requires of us, especially the Gambia at a crossroad, our debt means that we need to be able to access the information in a very transparent way to be able to hold government accountable as well. Then the ninth issue is technological advancements, as I said. I've already alluded to this as well, but I think, when we think about where the Gambian context is, I think we also need to acknowledge that, our limitations as one of the least developed countries. So I do think as we think about investment in tech, investment in this area, is also to look to our closer neighbors, right, in the region. So thinking about Kenya, thinking about Nigeria, and some of the incredible work that has been done to support innovation. I do think sometimes we think beyond, I mean, it's not bad to dream, but really looking at the US and Europe is not realistic for us, right? And so thinking about, when we're thinking about some of these things to bring it closer to home, especially looking at other African countries that have made progress as a relation to this. But I also think particularly as we think about tech and some of the incredible work being done by, and I see some folks in the room as well, that have invested and are currently engaged in innovative ways and having tech hubs as well. I think it's really investing money, investing resources, but also making sure that our investment framework, our investment and policy framework is conducive in a way that welcomes investors, that does not make it difficult for someone to come to Gambia and invest. And so thinking about the young people that are also entrepreneurs and are doing the incredible work, especially around tech, and the need to support them as well. And finally, I'm glad I haven't seen anybody sleep yet. The last point I wanted to talk about was social cohesion, religious tolerance, which I'm sure wouldn't be a surprise as well. I think for me, I've always, wherever I am, it's really acknowledging that first of all, I am Gambian, I'm African, I'm West African, but it's also really able to say, oh, you know what, in Gambia, it doesn't really matter whether you're Christian or you're Muslim, right? I celebrate Christmas, I celebrate Eid, right? Everybody will dress up, regardless, we'll give each other either meat or nanburu, which I actually miss very much. I should look for somebody to give me some nanburu. But I think what really, I struggle with, and I don't have this answer in terms of what is Gambianness to us and what our national identity is. I'm sure there are experts in the room that can sort of go into that as well. But I also think what is really beautiful about the Gambia is just our blend of our faiths, whether that's Christianity or Muslim, or whether you practice or do not believe in God or have your own belief as well. I think it was just this space that was very tolerant as well, and just this idea that I know I'm Mandinka, so I'm not gonna try the Mandinka, so I'll try the Wolof because I'm Mandinka, social bandula, so I'll try the Wolof. But like kunde ham respect samoram, right? Dunda si jama, right? Really allowing other people to be able to practice their religion as well. So I do think, and I'm sure most of you, or if not all of you, I really alarm at I from my own perspective as it relates to the transnational movement of ideas, especially religious fundamentalist ideas that we've seen in this country. I think it really causes and continues to cause problems for us. I know this is a national issue because there has been a lot of talk around as well. I do think part of the approach is really trying to also empower religious leaders, especially those that support and promote tolerance and inclusive interpretation of faith. And here I'll turn to the media, because I think the media has also been one of the contributors, especially as it relates to the rising tension as well. I think the media has an important role to make sure that they do not center scholars, they do not center Islamic scholars and Islamic leaders that continue to push for intolerant ideas, that continues to import conservative fundamentalist religious ideas from elsewhere as well. And I think everybody will know my opinion, obviously, on the female genital mutilation saga, and I think that really speaks to that issue as well. But I also think part of what we should also be thinking about and bringing it back, I'm always trying to bring it back to young people as well, but also youth, because I do think really if we are to move as a nation, these are the two groups of people that can move the needle, especially in our current context as well. Is really thinking about how we encourage religious tolerance in schools, particularly thinking about curriculum as well, especially for those as well. And just in terms of wrapping that, I think, and just to re-echo as well, I think that the Gambian context, especially as we think about the a nation that has always been built on tolerance and mutual respect, also speaks to our cultural context, whether you're a Mandinka, whether you're a Wolof, whether you're Aku or Jola or Manjago or whatever, right? Is really being able to pay attention to this current context and how that sort of supports and contributes to the social cohesion as well. I already spoke about this, but I wanted to end especially on that piece to say that I think our tolerance as a nation, especially as we're thinking about social cohesion, also means and requires us to stop the war on women and their bodies. It is theirs, and they're supposed to ensure that they can exercise their bodily autonomy as well. Okay, so given all the problems, as well, and I do appreciate the fact that you're all here and still here with me. So I'll just try to wrap up at least in the next 10 minutes. I wanted to say a few minutes, but I was like, yeah, let me not as well. Okay, just on the path forward, and really what I will do as well. I wasn't going through the whole keynote as well. Is actually getting it published, because that's what academics also do as well. So I'll go back to it, and you will see actually in the keynote that I started putting citations and references as the academic in me as well. But I think as we just think about the path forward as well, is really thinking about how we sort of cultivate a Gambia that really asks of us, as I said, to reevaluate our governance system as is currently but also to ensure that even as we think about democracy, that we're not just mimicking ideas from elsewhere, but that we're also making sure that these are locally contextualized as well. I think, regardless of whatever chosen system we do go with and continue to go with, strengthening local governance is crucial. And I just go back to the former President Karaba, who noted that democracy should be a culture that has to be learned. And so that requires that power must at all times be guided by law and society, and that it must be governed by conscience as well. And so thinking about how we empower local communities, how we empower local actors to be able to make decisions that directly impact their lives as well. And so thinking about, ways that we can strengthen the Gambia's Republican system. As you can see, obviously, I intentionally, from the beginning, did not define what Republicanism is. So, Said is welcome to come do that. But as I said, I wanted to pivot less from the theorization and thinking more in practical ways what our current context and challenges are. I think you'll all agree with me that we do need a new constitution urgently. And now I think we've been promised for a long time that a new constitutional order, I think where we are, is needed as it relates to, both in relation to providing a conducive basis, especially as we continue to engage in a very ambitious transitional justice process, but that it can also address some of the inequities that I already mentioned, whether that has to do with the inadequate representation of women and young people, but also addressing the deficient constitutional framework that we have that really centers executive power, that really should focus on how we ensure inclusive governance, as well as checks and balances as well. And this is really something that we also try to do, especially, and again, a plug on our collected volume, The Gambia in Transition Towards a New Constitutional Order. It is open access, so just download as well. But I think, beyond just having a new constitution as well, I think, strong institutions, which I'm sure we all agree on, like the judiciary, a culture of respect, especially as we see the building of a human rights culture through the National Human Rights Commission, is really vital in terms of all holding, even as we currently have the 1997 Constitution, ensuring that we respect and protect the fundamental rights of all, but also speaking to upholding the ideals of constitutionalism, including checks and balances as well. In terms of fostering, I think a deeper appreciation of republicanism and what that means, I think partly is really thinking about civic education in schools, but also other ways that, thinking about this space, this inaugural lecture as well, as a space to really think and strategize, not just theoretically, but also very practically as well, given the diverse stakeholders in the room as well. As somebody that grew up in the civil society space, we do need and continue to need a strong civil society, not just a civil society that is there, but a civil society that is also well-resourced and well-trained to be able to hold government accountable, especially as it relates to some of these issues as well. But I also think, going back to just the idea of tolerance within the Gambian context, is also just being able to encourage and promote a culture of healthy debate, because I do think dialogue is important. Even dialogue between opposing sides is important, and it should be, dialogue should be a method, a dialogical method that really provides space for us to engage. We can agree to disagree, but really where we can engage in very respectful debates, because regardless of whatever side we are, this is our country. If it goes well, it's for all of us. If it goes wrong, that's on us. So it shouldn't really matter, and we should be able to engage as well. And then finally, on the conclusion is to, re-echo a call to reimagine and building a Gambia for the future. I think, for me, part of the takeaway, especially when I was thinking about this public lecture and preparing for it as well, is that I think we also need to be honest with ourselves. We need to engage in critical self-reflection, whether that's civil society, whether that's government, whether that's the private sector. I think it is important that we engage in critical self-reflection of our current institutions and what they're supposed to be doing, given sort of the insights. As I said, that wasn't an exhaustive list. Obviously, we have more issues as well, but thinking about, when we think about building a better Gambia, it needs to start with us engaging with, what our core values are and how we can sort of push the needle as it relates to that. But I think for me, the takeaway really is if we are to move the needle, we can only do it collectively. And so that takes me back to the idea that we need to engage, respectfully, but also engage in the way that calls for us to work collectively as individuals, as Gambians, as individuals in this country, in relation to also demanding a new breed of leadership, one that is reflected both at the national and local level, but one that, and I re-echo again, I know, I'm saying it again, but re-echo inclusive leadership that really centers women and young people as well. I didn't have a quote. We were looking for a quote that speaks to republicanism, and I said that I had some couple of ideas, but they ended up all being the quote unquote the forefathers. So I intentionally did not use it. But I wanted to end. It's always this idea that when you're doing a public lecture, maybe end with a memorial quote as well. But I do not have one. But I think I just wanted to re-echo the call for us all to collectively work together in terms of thinking, strategizing as well. Bruce Lee, the karate guy, right, talks about this idea of be water, right? Be water. And I think as Gambians, we are very rigid in our mindset. This is partly an afterlife of our 22 years of authoritarianism. But also, if we go beyond that, obviously, as we think about decolonizing the mind, the colonial legacy and the afterlife as well, I think we should, both in terms of our thinking and in terms of our action, be flexible in a way that takes us through thinking to action, but also gives us the space to go back to thinking and then re-engage in action as well. Again, I'll stop here because we do have the fantastic discussants. I don't know what they're gonna say, but to again express my gratitude. This is truly an honor. When Sia told me, I was like, why will you want me? right? But I think he also mentioned the idea that this is our country, right? And our generation is really the generation that will take us from where we are. And so I do thank you for listening to me ramble for the past 1 hour. I don't know how long I've been speaking, but to again express my gratitude to all of you. Thank you. I'm gonna try. Thank you. I think it's you.
Okay. Oh, you brought all the papers.